Hey, this is Josh Green. I am a real estate consultant, market analyst, sometimes developer, educator here in Salt Lake City, Utah area. I wanted to just talk about one of the tools that I use in my real estate consulting work, and that's the Census Bureau. There is so much information there. There's some pros and cons with using the census data, but I wanted to show you, why I use this. I use it in pretty much every report that I do for clients and for my own projects as well. And the class that I teach at the University of Utah in real estate market analysis, we dive into the census quite a bit as well. But here's kind of why it's a useful tool, because it really helps you understand what's going on with the demographics. And there's all kinds of other information available on the census's website, data that they collect. But a lot of what I do is residential, and we're trying to understand people, right? And where people live and what their households look like. What is the place that they live? What does it look like? How many bedrooms? What do their incomes look like? And so this all on my screen here, this all comes from the census. And so we can learn things about what percentage of the people that live in whatever geography we're looking at, what percentage of those are owners versus renters, like what percent own their home versus what percent rent their home or wherever they live. There's all kinds of interesting stuff here about household size. How many people are living in, whether it's owners or renters, how many people are living in one household together. And that starts to be really helpful when working on a market study for a client, is understanding kind of the makeup of the people. So if I were working on a project where a developer came to me, wanted to build something for rent, apartments for rent, right? I would be looking at the Census Bureau's data on renter households. And I've got a city pulled up here already, but if I'm looking at this is a big chunk. Almost 70% of the renters in this area are smaller households, right? Like 1, 2, or 3 person households. What gets interesting, then we can look at, there's age, income, all of these other things. But what I want to show you is we can kind of look at, once we understand, okay, here's the kind of the household size, the age, how does that relate to where they're living, right? And so this is another table available on the census. This is looking at bedrooms. How many bedrooms are in the home where these households are renting, right? So in this particular area, about 80% of the rental units that are occupied have 2 or 3 bedrooms. That may tell us something about the potential for this market, right? Because if we're looking up here and we've got this big percent of renters that are 1 or 2 people, and we look at where they're renting down here, there's probably a case to be made for some 1-bedroom units in this area. There's all kinds of other things that are like really interesting. You can really dive into the weeds on age, incomes, all these other things. But all of this comes from the census. And so what I wanted this video to be is showing how to use the census data and the website to start pulling in some of this data, right? So this is the census website, data.census.gov. Before we jump into this, I think probably most people are familiar with the decennial census, right? Once every 10 years, the Census Bureau does this massive collection of data, and they collect that data. As you can imagine, there's a lot of planning that goes ahead of that. Then they're out collecting data, and it takes a while to process all that, to do quality control, and then to release the data to the public, right? So even though we do a decennial census, last one was 2020, right? It took a little while for that data to come out because it had to go through this process. So that's one of the downsides of the census, is it can lag a little bit, right? By the time it goes through this whole process of planning, data collection, quality control, to releasing data, that takes a good amount of time. And so the data is lagging a little bit, and we can look at that here in a second. On the positive side, though, this is probably like the best source that we have. And even other demographic resources, they use the Census Bureau as kind of their baseline. They may make some assumptions, make some projections based on their own methodology, but they're using the Census Bureau as kind of the baseline. It really is a great data source, even though it does have some limitations. But this is the interface, right? And this is free for anyone to use. It's just here at data.census.gov. And you can start right away. You can search for whatever it is you're looking for. Personally, I like to start with the filters. And you'll see the way that this is organized. It's organized by geography and also by data table, right? So you can narrow it down if you're looking for population, right, we can pull up the population data table, and then we can look at, the United States. We can look state level. We can look at county level. We can look county subdivision. That's like a further breakdown of the county, a place, which is not a name for a city, right? If we're looking for city data, that's a place. All the way down to zip code, census tract, even down to blocks and block groups. Like that's like the smallest, like the most granular data that's available. And so you can see here on the side on the filters, we start at the top with the entire country, right? And it goes down more and more specific until you get to block group, which is like the smallest geography you can look at in the Census Bureau. Let's just pull something up here, right? So let's do place. I live in Utah, like I mentioned, Salt Lake City area. So we'll go down here to Utah. This will pull up all the cities in Utah, right? So if I plug in Salt Lake City, there it is right there. So this adds the filter to this upper left-hand corner, right? So we can see we're looking at Salt Lake City, Utah pretty quickly. The other thing that's cool is once you've selected a geography, you can click on maps and it will pull up a map showing you the boundaries of that area. And so we could do the same thing for, if we're looking at zip code, if we're looking at county, block, all of any of those geographies in that filter section. Once they're loaded in there as filters, we can look at the map and see exactly where we're looking at. This is really helpful when you're trying to, when you're looking at a region or a certain geography where there are similar, characteristics as far as employment demographics across several cities or, even across, several counties, whatever it is. So that's a helpful tool here. But let's go back here to tables. So I mentioned that the census data is organized by geography, which we talked about a little bit, and by data table. And there's, I don't know, probably tens of thousands of data tables of pieces of information that you can access. And there's some like really obscure, kind of strange things in here. You can look at actually, well, we'll talk about that in a second. One of the most common ones that I use is tenure. Tenure just means is it an owner household or is it a renter household? And there's a table for that. Several tables actually. I'll paste the common tables that I use in the comments here. You could search for tenure, it would pull up the same thing. But let's just look at what this looks like. Place, Utah, Salt Lake City. There we go. So now we're showing the filters here. Salt Lake City. This table B25003, that's the table that shows the tenure information. So if I close this now, so what we're looking at here, this is how many total households there are in Salt Lake City. And households is different than population, right? This is how many 10 people in it, right? It would count as one household. You'd have a household with one person in it. It would also count as one household. In Salt Lake City, there's just under 100,000 households. And this is as of 2024. And of those, 43,623 are owner occupied. They own the home, the townhome, the condo, whatever it is that they live in. They own the place where they live. And renter occupied, these are obviously renters, right? So interesting thing right away, just looking at this, is there are more renters in Salt Lake City than there are owners. So anyway, just one piece of information. Let's look at another one that I use a lot. Let's look at household income, because I use these a lot. I know the table numbers, so we'll just type it in here. I also could have searched household income. Okay, now this is going to show me, this is awesome, because if you're doing a market study, you're looking at, say a builder that's, looking to build homes, knowing what the incomes are of the people that live there is really important, right? You want to have some idea of, are people going to be able to afford these homes or not, right? And so this table helps with that. So this shows, again, owner occupied households, and this shows how much that household makes per year. So it's broken down into all these bands. Let's see, our biggest percentage here is 18,500 households in Salt Lake City that are making $150,000 or more per year. Same thing with renters, right? We can look down here. This is broken out. So these are all renter households in Salt Lake City. And we can see incomes are a little bit less, right? Our biggest population, 11,600 households, is in this $50,000 to $75,000 annual income range. Okay, that can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out, if you're building apartments, you have an idea what the rent is going to be. Then the question is, okay, how many renters are there that can afford that type of rent in Salt Lake City? Another thing to point out here is this margin of error. With any statistical survey. The Census Bureau does the best they can to collect information from every household, right? From every person. So there is a margin of error here. So what this tells you, there's estimated to be 18,534 owner households that make $150,000 or more per year, plus or minus 2,640, right? So there's a margin of error because of just the nature of collecting this much data. There's a statistical margin of error. It's not exactly perfect, right? So this could be as high as 20,000 plus, or it could be 16,000, right? There's a margin of error associated with it. Another interesting thing just to point out while we're here and talking about margin of error. So we can go up here. I should have explained this before, right? Every decade, there's the decennial census, right? Every 10 years, there's like the big census. But the Census Bureau does surveys in between. They don't just wait until the next 10 years to do a survey. They're doing these smaller surveys in between, and they're publishing actually data every year in between. So that survey is called the American Community Survey. So what we're looking at right here, if you can see on my screen, this is the American Community Survey data. This is survey data that was done in between, because we're in 2024, right? There hasn't been another decennial census since 2020. So this is a smaller survey that's done more frequently. The other thing that's important here is the year that we're looking at. So this is 2024, but if you'll notice here, it says 1 year estimates. If I click on this, this will show, all of the other available time periods that the data is available for. The 1 year estimates is basically, it's looking at 1 year's survey data. There's also a 2024 5-year estimates data. They're looking over the past 5 years and kind of combining all that data to make some inferences about all of these things. One thing that you'll notice, we're in 2026 now, right? So we're 2 years behind already, talking about that lag in data being published, right? Going through that quality control before it's published. We're just talking about margin of error. So let's go back here really quick. So on this $150,000 or more per household, the margin of error was 2,640 plus or minus. What you'll find in most cases, every case that I can think of, is if you go to the 5-year estimates, that margin of error is probably going to be lower. The margin of error is it's less than 1,000, right? 778. And that's because they're working with a bigger data set, right? They're working with a data set that's over 5 years instead of just a 1 year snapshot. So it's kind of a balance, right? So the 5-year estimates have a lower margin of error, but they kind of lag behind, right? So if we're looking at the same year, 2024, now we're only showing less than 16,000 households in this income band, where if we're looking at just the 1 year survey data, 18,500. So something to keep in mind. It's a one of the pros and cons of working with the census data. You just have to understand what you're looking at. And if you're using data from a bunch of different tables, just make sure that you're consistent, that you're using the same. If you're going to use the 1 year estimates, make sure that every other data table you're looking at is also the 1 year estimates. I mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of strange things that are, if you dig into what's available here, there's all kinds of really interesting things. This is one that I just found this morning before, getting ready to do this video. So this is means of transportation to work by time arriving at work. This is interesting, right? So you can go down here. So what this is telling you is someone that's driving alone in a car, truck, or van, this is what time they're arriving at work. This shows you how many people are arriving to work at those different times. How could this be useful, right? Think about if you're an office owner, if you're a retail owner, right? Knowing these kind of traffic patterns could be really helpful to that type of asset. If you're, even thinking about traffic, that could be helpful to know when are more people commuting, when are more people arriving at work. But this gets super interesting, right? So this is people driving alone in a car, truck, or van. This is what time they get to work. Now we can look at carpools, those taking public transportation. What time do they get to work? If they walked, right? Not a lot of people walking to work here relatively, right? Taxi or ride sharing, Uber. Anyway, the point here is there's all kinds of really interesting things that are available here, and you kind of just has to dig through it and do some searching around, do some exploring. One piece of information that I found, we did a little project that was kind of a co-working building, small scale, 3,500 square feet in a suburban area. And it worked really well. Like there were a lot of business owners that were working from home that wanted a place outside of their work, outside of their home to go work. They didn't want to drive all the way, to Salt Lake or somewhere else where there's, other office buildings. They didn't want to rent a full office space. And that worked really well. And so digging into the Census Bureau, I found there is a data table that shows you how many people work from home. I use that to build a map, right, of okay, where could we replicate the same idea? We found several other cities that have a high percentage of people working from home. Those may make good places for that type of real estate. So I hope this has been helpful. This is a tool that I use every day in the work that I do in consulting for my clients, for myself working on my own projects, in my teaching. It's a really powerful tool with some downsides, right? And you've got to understand kind of the pros and cons and the limitations of what's available here. But I hope that is helpful to you in some way. And if I can be helpful beyond this and answer any questions for you, feel free to reach out. I'd love to have you subscribe to my newsletter where I talk about things like this. I do consulting work on a regular basis. And if I can help you with anything, please let me know. Thank you.